Please, my queen, do not cast me aside. I have served you faithfully.
No one truly knows what Elizabeth said in her final hours. No one knows if she named an heir, whispered a single name, or simply stared past the men begging at her bedside. All we know is that by the time the sun rose over Richmond Palace on that cold March morning of the year 1603, the most mysterious Queen England had ever known was gone, and a century of Tudor rule died with her. But the strangest part of all is this: Elizabeth's death did not end with her. It began with the lies told after she took her last breath, the political schemes already swirling around her bed, and the desperate scramble for power that would shape the kingdom she left behind. Her body had not yet cooled when the first version of her death was rewritten, polished, and manipulated because the truth was far too dangerous to tell. For 45 years, she had ruled as a queen without a husband, a monarch without a child, and a woman who refused to be claimed by any man, any country, or any church. She survived assassination plots, invasions, diseases, betrayals, and the public scrutiny of a world that believed a woman was a monster of nature if she dared to wield authority over men. She had held the kingdom together, not with heirs or marriages or alliances, but with her voice, her intelligence, and her terrifying ability to turn uncertainty into a weapon. And it was that same uncertainty, the refusal to name a successor, the refusal to marry, the refusal to explain herself, that would explode into a national crisis the moment she fell ill. It began long before her final days, in the year 1562 when she had been queen for just 4 years. Elizabeth nearly died of smallpox at Hampton Court. She was 29. Young, brilliant, radiant, and suddenly on the brink of death. The palace believed she would not survive. The Spanish ambassador wrote home, saying the queen was as good as gone. Her counselor panicked. But not only because they feared losing her, their terror came from something else entirely. Elizabeth had no heir. No husband. No child. And no plan. The crown had nowhere to go. And the kingdom was poised to collapse into chaos. And even after she recovered miraculously, against all expectation, Elizabeth never forgot that moment when a disease had nearly taken her life and left England without a future. But instead of solving the problem by marrying or naming a successor, she buried the issue deeper, turning silence into her shield. The more her counselors begged her to choose, the more she refused. For Elizabeth had seen what happened when a monarch named a successor. She had lived through her sister Mary's reign, when the entire country had looked past the dying queen and toward Elizabeth, treating her as the future, before she even wore the crown. She knew how dangerously fast loyalty could shift. She knew naming another heir invited every ambitious lord and foreign king to plot and negotiate, manipulate, and perhaps even kill to get closer to the throne. Princes cannot love their winding sheets, she once said, meaning, a living monarch cannot love the one waiting for their death. So she left England suspended for decades. A kingdom, ruled by a woman who refused to marry. A dynasty without future blood. A throne with no destination. And in that vacuum, rivals multiplied like shadows at dusk. Mary, Queen of Scots, with her Tudor lineage and Catholic supporters. Arabella Stuart, born on English soil, with a claim just strong enough to tempt conspirators. Edward Seymour, grandson of the woman Henry VIII, once named heir in his will. Each carried a spark that could ignite civil war. Each had supporters hungry enough to take risks, and each lived, knowing Elizabeth watched them, with the quiet intensity of a woman who had survived far too much to trust anyone. But the most dangerous of them all was James of Scotland, the son of Mary Stuart. raised Protestant, politically cautious, and infinitely patient. Elizabeth never acknowledged him as heir, not even unofficially. Yet behind her back, in the candle-lit corridors of her own court, her counselors whispered his name more often than hers. They sent secret letters, they made promises. They began preparing for a world after Elizabeth, long before she was ready to admit such a world could exist. And as the Queen grew older, her makeup thicker, her temper sharper, her smile more brittle, the inevitable truth pressed harder against the walls of the Tudor world. She would die without naming anyone, and the crown would be seized by whoever reached it first. That is the truth of Elizabeth's final days, not the romanticized tale written later, not the story pasted into manuscripts by royal biographers desperate to please the new king. That famous image, the dying queen lifting her hand, tracing a crown above her head at the mention of James, was a lie, added years after her death. In reality, she said nothing. Her silence was her final act, and that silence forced England into the arms of the man who had waited like a shadow for decades. Her funeral did not erase the unease. Her wooden effigy sat upon the coffin in Westminster Abbey, painted in white and gold, carrying the symbols of power she had clutched so fiercely. The streets of London were lined with faces that had known no other queen, eyes filled with awe and sorrow. 4 great gray horses, draped in black velvet, carried her through the city she had once commanded like a storm. And beneath the stone arches of the abbey, Elizabeth was lowered into her tomb beside Mary, 2 sisters who could never rule in harmony, now forced to sleep in the same chamber of eternity. But the truth, she left behind the truth of her silence, her refusal. Her mysteries would reshape England forever. When death came to call in the year 1562, it came not with a scream, but a slow tightening in her chest, a fever that robbed her breath, a shaking in her limbs that even her strongest silks could not conceal. It came in the midst of rising triumph, not failure, for Elizabeth, just 4 years into her reign, had already begun reshaping a kingdom torn by the brutality of her sister's fire and the weight of her brother's theologies. She had walked into power as a woman no one trusted, a Protestant no one believed would last, and above all, a virgin no one expected to stay unclaimed. And yet by the time she collapsed at Hampton Court, she had already begun weaving the impossible spell of her monarchy, one that glittered not with heirs or husbands, but with something even more elusive: authority without dependency, glory without surrender, and power that bent neither to man nor to Rome. The sickness began as a chill, a simple shiver beneath her bodice as she moved through the autumn air, and then it rooted itself deeper, turning to fire beneath her skin, to spots and swelling, to the unmistakable sign of smallpox, the great killer of the age, indifferent to bloodlines, merciless to youth, and swift to rob the lungs of air and the skin of its beauty. The court held its breath. The corridors of Hampton Court fell quiet, except for the scraping of boots and the hurried scribble of letters, as physicians gathered and whispered, and the Spanish ambassador wrote home that the Queen was mourned already as if dead. Foreign powers stirred. Elizabeth's ministers stood hollow-eyed and cold-palmed in the chambers nearby, preparing not just for the possibility of her death, but for the collapse of order itself. There was no heir. There was no husband. There was only the crown, gleaming, lonely, and suddenly suspended in the air, like a question no one dared answer. In those long hours of fever, when her ladies wept quietly and the firelight painted her cheeks with false life, Elizabeth drifted in and out of awareness, and in those moments of half-dream and pain, perhaps she remembered her mother, whose name had been spoken in shame for most of her life. Perhaps she recalled the stories of Anne Boleyn's execution, the sword from France, the false charges, the king's cold silence. Perhaps she saw in her own burning skin a legacy of women torn down not by failure, but by proximity to power. And perhaps she saw what was coming if she did not rise from that bed, the scramble for succession, the foreign invasions, the blood that would be spilled in her name and against it. But even in the haze of illness, her will did not shatter. And then, against every expectation, Elizabeth opened her eyes. She lived, but she did not emerge unmarked. Her face, once praised for its smoothness and youth, bore the scars of her survival. Smallpox had left its evidence upon her cheeks, her forehead, her neck, and though she covered it in time with the thick white paste of Venetian ceruse, the deadly lead-based cosmetic that would later drain her strength, the world knew the truth. The Queen had come close to death. The Queen could bleed. The Queen could break. That brush with mortality transformed her reign. It hardened her resolve not to bend to the demands of marriage. For if death could strike so easily, how could she risk giving her kingdom to a husband who might seize it? How could she bear a child whose very existence would turn the eyes of every nobleman and foreign agent away from her and toward the next generation? No, Elizabeth would not give them that. She had seen how a queen's body could be used as battlefield. Her sister Mary had married Philip of Spain and watched her people turn against her. Her own mother had married a king and lost her head. The lesson was carved, not only in history, but in the architecture of her own family's destruction. So she chose herself, and the world did not understand. They begged her, year after year, to marry. Parliament pleaded, ambassadors petitioned, suitors arrived with jewels and treaties, with promises of armies and alliances. She allowed them to hope. She danced with them, dined with them, entertained their letters and their portraits, and with a single glance or smile made nations believe they stood on the edge of union. But it was all illusion, a performance so skillful, so calculated, that few understood they were actors on a stage she herself had written. And when they pressed her, when they asked plainly whom she would choose, she smiled and gave them riddles. "I am already married to England," she would say, and there was no greater loyalty she could offer. Even Robert Dudley, the man whose presence so often stirred the court into murmur, was kept at a careful distance. She had known him since childhood, trusted him, perhaps even loved him. But Elizabeth would not surrender her authority, not even for affection. She gave him favor, titles, power, but never her hand. Their closeness was a dangerous kind of intimacy, one that fueled rumors and suspicion, but never led to the altar. For Elizabeth understood what Dudley did not love. For a queen was not freedom. It was a snare. And all the while, the question of succession deepened like a wound. Her counselors feared instability. Foreign courts waited for her death like wolves watching a limping deer. And yet Elizabeth gave them nothing. No child, no heir, no whisper of a name to follow hers. "Princes cannot love their winding sheets," she said, meaning she would not name her successor because to do so was to embrace death, and Elizabeth had stared too long into that abyss already. So the kingdom waited, and waited, and waited. Every decade brought new candidates, new whispers. Mary, Queen of Scots, still alive at that time, was perhaps the most dangerous. Others emerged: Arbella Stuart, Edward Seymour, the Earl of Huntingdon. Some had stronger blood claims. Some had English birth. Some had the support of powerful factions. But Elizabeth said nothing. Her silence was not indecision. It was defiance. She would not be eclipsed while still breathing. No one would stand in her shadow. She would be the only sun in the English sky. And so she reigned, not in the shadow of death, but beside it, always aware that the throne beneath her feet had no confirmed heir. She ruled with the constant hum of tension beneath her every word, every proclamation. But that tension became her power because no one knew what would happen next. Everyone was forced to focus on the present, on her, not the future, not the after, but Elizabeth. In this way, the girl who once lay dying at Hampton Court became not just the Queen of England, but its center of gravity. Her refusal to marry, her refusal to name an heir, her refusal to be predictable, these were not weaknesses. They were weapons. And though the men around her never stopped complaining, never stopped worrying, never stopped waiting for her to bend, she never did. The scars on her face were not shame. They were proof. She had survived. And survival, for Elizabeth, was the first act of empire. They gathered like moths to candlelight, some with velvet gloves, others with daggers behind their backs, but all of them drawn by the same thing, a throne without an heir. Elizabeth, for all her majesty, had left a gap at the heart of the English crown. And those with royal blood, no matter how thin, no matter how disputed, could not help but stare into that space and imagine their names engraved upon it. She had lived for decades refusing to name a successor, and so the silence around her throne did not remain empty. It filled itself, slowly and dangerously, with contenders, whispers, and watchful eyes. They called them claimants. But they were more than names on a family tree. They were walking ambitions, each with their own allies, their own causes, their own visions of what England could become under their rule. First among them, always, was Mary, Queen of Scots, the rival whose very existence seemed crafted by the gods of irony. Catholic where Elizabeth was Protestant, maternal where Elizabeth was childless, married and widowed, while Elizabeth remained untouchably single. Mary had been queen since infancy, raised in France, draped in wealth and elegance, carrying a bloodline that traced cleanly back to Henry VII through his daughter, Margaret Tudor. By the laws of blood, she had the clearest claim. By the laws of power, she was the most dangerous woman in Europe. Elizabeth had once tried to control Mary, tried to keep her close, then tried to keep her far, then tried to keep her quiet. But nothing worked. Mary's presence ignited rebellion. She became the banner for every Catholic conspiracy, every foreign plot, every noble household disillusioned by Elizabeth's refusal to marry, to birth, to name. And so, Elizabeth made a decision not out of rage, but out of necessity. She imprisoned her, not for a week, not for a season, but for nearly 20 years. And still, even in her captivity, Mary's name moved armies. But she was not the only one. Further down the Scottish branch, there was Arbella Stuart, a woman with noble charm and a Tudor thread of her own. She was born on English soil, which made her more palatable to those who feared foreign kings. She was quiet, bookish, and seemed manageable to the eyes of Elizabeth's counselors. But even the mildest branch can bear poisonous fruit. Arbella had supporters, and some whispered that she should be wed to a powerful Protestant prince to solidify her claim. Her name remained in the air, never quite spoken aloud by Elizabeth, but never forgotten. Then there was Edward Seymour, Lord Beauchamp, the son of Lady Catherine Grey, and Edward Seymour, The first Earl of Hertford, Catherine Grey, herself had once been a threat. A living reminder that the Grey sisters had been named heirs in the will of Henry VIII, though her marriage had been declared invalid by Elizabeth, and her children labeled illegitimate. There were many who believed that Edward Seymour had a rightful claim. He was young, Protestant, and carried a name tied to the old nobility. For a time, it was said, he was considered the preferred heir by some of the Queen's own counselors. But legitimacy, like loyalty, was never a sure thing in the Tudor court. And then there was Henry Hastings, Earl of Huntingdon, a man of Yorkist blood. Distant but undeniably noble, he had no strong foreign ties, no direct link to Catholic causes, and no ambitions that ever surfaced in public. Yet his family tree reached back to Lady Margaret Pole, niece to King Edward IV, and that alone was enough to place him in the running. He was discreet, perhaps too much so, but some in the Privy Council favored his quietness over Mary's fire, or Arbella's uncertainty. Even Robert Dudley, Elizabeth's most beloved, supported Hastings as a potential successor, and that support meant something. For every contender, there were backers. For every backer, there were letters, secret meetings, promises made in fire-lit rooms, behind tapestried doors. It became a quiet war beneath the surface of Elizabeth's peace. No swords drawn, no armies raised. Not yet, but a war of inheritance, a war of waiting. And all the while, Elizabeth watched. She said nothing. She wrote nothing. She declared nothing. Her silence was not ignorance. It was strategy. She understood what naming a successor would mean. She had lived it. During her sister Mary's reign, Elizabeth herself had been the heir. A parent watched. Way ahead. Nearly executed. She had seen how quickly the people's love could shift to the next sovereign before the current one was even buried. She had felt the loneliness of waiting for another's death. She had worn the crown of anxiety before ever wearing the real one. And so she would not place that burden upon another. Or, perhaps, she would not allow another to steal the light that still shone solely on her. But time was not patient. As the years passed and Elizabeth moved through her 40s, then her 50s, then her 60s, the voices around her grew louder. Parliament petitioned. The people murmured. Foreign kings watched like chess players, waiting for their opponent to falter. Even her closest counselors began to shift their weight between two worlds, the world of Elizabeth and the world to come. And in the far north, James of Scotland waited. He was the son of her greatest rival, a Protestant king, clever, cautious, raised to believe that one day, England would be his. He wrote to Elizabeth with polite affection, calling her dearest aunt, offering diplomatic calm in exchange for silent acknowledgement. He knew the game. He played it well. Some say Elizabeth admired him. Others say she feared him. But she never named him. Instead, she let the question hover like a dagger, suspended above the realm. Always there. Always dangerous. Always unclaimed. And so England drifted. The throne remained filled and yet empty. Elizabeth's image grew ever more divine. Even as her body aged, she was the only monarch in living memory for an entire generation. Children were born, raised, married, and had their own children without ever knowing another ruler. She had become more than a queen. She was the nation's heartbeat. And yet, behind every celebration, behind every portrait, behind every speech spoken beneath golden rafters, the same truth loomed: England had no next. Only Elizabeth. and silence. She came not with an army, but with a story, one forged in blood, cloaked in silk, and weighed down by a crown that never sat easy. Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, had ruled since the cradle, married into the most powerful throne in Europe, buried her young husband in a golden tomb, returned to her own land to reclaim power, and watched it all unravel in betrayal and whispers. When she crossed the border into England in the year 1568, it was not with triumph, but with desperation. She came seeking sanctuary. What she found was a prison. Elizabeth received the news with cold calculation. Her cousin, her rival, her mirror, was on English soil. It was not a blessing. It was a spark tossed into dry straw. Mary carried with her the bloodline of Margaret Tudor, sister of Henry VII, a claim to the English crown that to many Catholics was not only stronger, but legitimate in ways Elizabeth's was not. To welcome her openly would be to invite rebellion. To send her away would be to appear afraid. So Elizabeth did what she always did in moments of crisis. She waited. She observed. She made the silence stretch until it became a web. Mary was not imprisoned in chains. She was given rooms, servants, gowns, but she was not free. Her life became a series of relocations, always under guard, always under watch. One great house after another, each more beautiful, more suffocating. She was a queen in name, but a shadow in reality. And even so, she was dangerous. Letters crossed borders. Supporters gathered in secret. Plots whispered her name as if it were a blessing. As if to free Mary was to restore God's will upon the throne of England. She denied involvement. She played the innocent, but the truth, as always, was buried in ink and silence. Elizabeth did not act rashly. For nearly 2 decades, she allowed Mary to live. Some said she hesitated because they were cousins. Some said it was guilt, or superstition, or fear of divine punishment for the execution of a queen anointed by God. But the real reason was more precise. Elizabeth knew what Mary represented. She was not just a woman in exile. She was a banner for every Catholic cause. A living weapon to be aimed by foreign hands. Spain, France, the papacy all watched her. And so long as Mary breathed, Elizabeth ruled with one eye over her shoulder. The pressure grew with each year. Parliament urged action. Advisors presented proof of treason. Mary had written letters encrypted, encoded, but intercepted and deciphered. The Babington Plot. They called it a plan to assassinate Elizabeth, led by young idealists who dreamed of restoring Catholic England. And at the center of it all, Mary's handwriting, her seal, her consent. Elizabeth read the evidence in silence. There is no record of what she felt. No diary entry. No spoken confession. But her counselors said her face turned pale. That she stood alone in her chamber, long after the candles had died. That she wept not for the threat, but for the choice. To execute Mary was to execute a queen. It had never been done before. Not like this. Elizabeth, daughter of a woman who had died on the scaffold, understood the horror of it better than most. But the threat was no longer theoretical. It was inked in plots and blood, and the trembling pulse of an aging queen who had no heir. Mary was not just a rival. She was a fuse. So Elizabeth signed the death warrant, and then tried to take it back. But the wheels of the state, once turned, did not wait. The council acted swiftly. The order was sent. The execution prepared. Elizabeth's hesitation arrived too late. On the morning of the 8th day of February, in the year 1587, Mary Stuart walked into the great hall of Fotheringhay Castle, dressed in red, the color of Catholic martyrdom. She carried a rosary. Her voice did not shake. She forgave her executioner. She knelt with dignity. And when the axe fell, it did not kill her in a single strike. It took 3. The first struck bone. The second struck muscle. The third ended the myth. The moment her head fell, a silence spread across Europe. Then came the rage. Elizabeth locked herself away for days. When she emerged, she claimed the council had acted without her full consent. She blamed her secretary. She cursed the haste. But none of it could change what had been done. A queen had executed a queen. And history would not forget. Mary was buried. Not in disgrace, but in royal ceremony, and years later, her son James, who had watched it all from the cold halls of Scotland, would bring her body south to rest in Westminster Abbey, not far from the woman who had killed her. 2 queens, 2 cousins, 2 claims to the same throne, now buried beneath the same stone sky. But long before that, in the hearts of many, Mary had already won something Elizabeth never could: martyrdom. Elizabeth would rule for 16 more years. But from that day onward, the air around her changed. The crown weighed heavier. The court grew colder. The mask grew thicker. She had removed a rival. But in doing so, she had also lost the one person who could truly understand what it meant to live in the gilded cage of royalty. Mary had played her final card, and Elizabeth had called it with an axe. The world remembers them now, not just as enemies, but as opposites. Mary the beautiful, passionate, tragic queen, undone by love and politics. Elizabeth the cold, cunning survivor, who chose duty over desire, nation over blood. But the truth was never so simple. They were not merely rivals. They were reflections. And in the end, both were broken by the very thrones they tried to hold. He was always there, even when she would not speak his name. James of Scotland, son of Mary Stuart, heir by blood, Protestant by education, king by birthright. Elizabeth had never called him son, never called him nephew, and never even met him face to face. But his shadow lengthened each year she grew older. And though she refused to name a successor, the court, the ambassadors, and the people all knew where the crown would likely fall when her breath ceased. James did not demand it. He waited, and that waiting, calm, calculated, persistent, was what made him so dangerous. He had been born into chaos. His mother, forced to abdicate before he was even 2 years old, fled into England and into captivity, leaving him a crown but no protection. Raised by regents and surrounded by Scottish lords with shifting loyalties and sharp daggers, James learned early how to survive without allies and how to wear the crown as both shield and weapon. He studied the Bible. He read philosophy. He watched men lie and flatter and betray. And somewhere in the quiet of his boyhood, he decided something that would define his life, that one day he would sit not only on the Scottish throne, but on the English one as well. Elizabeth knew it. Her council knew it. And as she entered her 7th decade, her body slowing and her vision dimming, that knowledge hung around her like the scent of cold iron. There were other claimants still: Arbella Stuart with her English birth, Edward Seymour with his grey blood, the ever-watchful nobles who dreamed of reshuffling the deck. But none held the same inevitability as James. He had the bloodline, he had the Protestant faith, and most importantly, he had the patience to wait for the right moment without pressing too hard. Still, Elizabeth said nothing. She had survived because of her silence. Not despite it. To name a successor was to invite death. She had always believed that. She remembered what it had meant to be the heir apparent under Mary's rule. How the eyes of the court had turned toward her with curiosity and suspicion. How the weight of expectation had nearly pulled her into the grave. She would not do that to herself. And she would not give anyone else the satisfaction of stepping into her light before her body had even cooled. But silence did not stop the wind from shifting. Courtiers began to make quiet journeys north. Letters were exchanged, folded and sealed in wax, passed from hand to hand with trembling discretion. Flatteries were offered to the King of Scots, small things, phrases in foreign tongues, subtle gestures of allegiance. Even Elizabeth's own counselors, those who had served her for decades, began to hedge their bets. William Cecil, who had stood beside her in the fiercest years of her youth, sent secret communications to James. So did his son Robert. Not betrayal. Exactly, but a hedge against chaos. For all their loyalty to the Queen, they understood the truth. The future was coming, and it had James's face. And James, for his part, played the game with skill. He wrote letters filled with warmth and respect, calling Elizabeth his most loving aunt, praising her wisdom, hinting at kinship, never overreaching. He sent diplomats to England, not to demand, but to observe. He made no public threats. He raised no army. Instead, he built a network of silent loyalty, layer by layer, year by year, until it became impossible to deny that when the Virgin Queen died, her crown would cross the border. The people of England began to accept it. Slowly, wearily. They were tired of uncertainty, tired of the question with no answer. Elizabeth had been their monarch for nearly half a century. She had been their sun and moon, their glory and fear, the only ruler most of them had ever known. But now she was old. Her teeth had blackened. Her hair was a memory beneath her orange wigs. Her voice, once thunderous, was a whisper carried by obligation. They loved her still, but they could no longer see her without also seeing the grave. In the palaces, the atmosphere changed. Feasts were quieter, councils more restless. The court no longer sparkled with hope. It moved like a clock, winding down, and everyone could hear the ticking. Elizabeth no longer rode out as often. Her appetite faded. She dismissed music, once her joy, and grew cold even toward her favorite plays. She wore mourning black, not for a person, but perhaps for herself. And through it all, the question pulsed like a wound no physician could close. Will she ever name him? She never did. Even as her strength waned, even as her counselors gathered at her bedside in Richmond, even as the fire dimmed in her eyes and her limbs trembled beneath velvet covers, she held her tongue. Legend tells us that, when asked directly, she raised her hand and drew a circle in the air above her head, a symbol of the crown. A silent nod to James. But that story, like so many around her death, is likely a lie, invented after the fact, polished by those who needed her silence to mean something. In truth, she died without ever naming him. She died, perhaps, hoping that death itself would make the choice for her. And in a way, I did. James was proclaimed King of England hours after her death. He received the news in Edinburgh with composed satisfaction. He made no triumphal speech. He did not gloat. He merely gathered his things, summoned his retinue, and began the long southward journey. Along the way, towns prepared celebrations, Crowds lined the roads, and yet in the quiet corners of England, some wept, not because they hated James, but because something ancient had ended, something that could not be replaced. Elizabeth had been their queen, not perfect, not gentle, but theirs. And now she was gone. She would not lie down, not for pain, not for age, not even for death. In the final weeks of her life, Queen Elizabeth refused the bed that had once been her sanctuary. She would not sleep beneath covers. She would not be seen horizontal, vulnerable, soft. Instead, she stood, sat, sank slowly into the cushions on the floor of her chamber, resting only in fragments, refusing the symbolism of surrender, for to lie down, even in illness, was to admit that the reign was ending, and Elizabeth, though her body trembled and her voice fell to whisper, still held tight to the idea that as long as she sat upright, she ruled. The courtiers watched with unease, her ladies with worry. The queen, once radiant with speeches and ceremony, had grown silent. She did not wish to be dressed. She turned her face away from the mirror. She rejected her physicians. She waved off prayers. What they saw in her was not only illness, but resistance. A slow, aching refusal to let go of the performance that had defined her for over 4 decades. She had become a monarch through ritual, and now she seemed to believe that as long as the rituals continued, she could outwit time itself. Her face, once delicate and expressive, had become a mask of lead. Literally, each morning, her ladies applied layer after layer of white ceruse, a thick, toxic paint that concealed the scarring left from smallpox in her youth. The very makeup that gave her that ghost-like, divine appearance was slowly poisoning her blood, dulling her strength, weakening her bones. But she would not go without it. Even when her hands trembled, even when her lips cracked, even when her breath came in shallow gasps, the paint had become her second skin. And she wore it not for vanity, but for authority. And above the paint, the wig, it was no longer hair, but architecture, an orange flame, coiled and towering, heavy with pins and jeweled ornaments. It was the crown she could wear even in private, for she would not be seen without it. To do so would be to reveal that she was, in the end, a woman beneath the myth. That age had bent her spine, loosened her teeth, hollowed her cheeks, that she had become mortal. So she remained adorned, even as her appetite faded and her voice fell away. Each day, fewer words passed her lips. The queen who had once commanded silence with a single glance now spoke only in fragments. At times she whispered prayers. At others, nothing at all. Those closest to her, desperate for instruction, leaned in, hoping for the name of a successor, a final word of command, a farewell. But Elizabeth gave them nothing. She clutched silence like a scepter. She ruled it as she had ruled England, with discipline, with calculation, and above all, with control. They begged her to take to bed. She refused. They asked her to eat. She declined. They urged her to speak. She turned away. And still, she sat upright. The fire in her chamber burned low, and the candlelight no longer danced in her eyes, but she remained upright in her chair, or slumped gently into the pile of cushions on the floor, like a figure carved in stone, silent, still, terrifyingly regal. Days passed like this, time bent in strange shapes, and around her, the palace at Richmond fell into a hush, as if the very walls were afraid to echo. Those who had known her in youth could hardly bear to look. Gone was the woman who had delivered speeches in Latin and Greek, who had rallied her navy against the Spanish Armada, who had spoken to her soldiers in Tilbury with fire in her voice and steel in her spine. Gone was the glittering center of the court, who once danced and sang and watched Shakespeare's players perform at her command. What remained was a woman wrapped in layers of velvet and dread, guarded not by swords but by silence. Some said she was grieving for Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex. Her final favorite had been executed under her own orders only 2 years earlier. After a failed rebellion and a betrayal too public to ignore, she had loved him, perhaps more than she should have. And when she sent him to the block, something in her heart fractured. After his death, she spoke less, smiled less. The court grew cold. Others said she was haunted, not by ghosts, but by the weight of her own choices. Mary Stuart's beheading, the deaths she had ordered, the crown she had protected with so many lives, the child she had never borne, the love she had never claimed, the heir she had never named. The burden of her solitude held so tightly for so long had begun to hollow her out from within. But if she regretted, she never said so. No one ever heard her whisper that she was tired. No one ever heard her ask to be relieved. And when her council pressed her for a final word, "Who shall inherit your crown?" "Majesty," she said nothing. There is the famous story that she raised her hand and made a circle in the air, a symbol of the crown, in silent assent to James of Scotland. But historians have now peeled back the truth, like a palimpsest. And we know that gesture may never have happened. It was a fiction written by those who needed the story to end cleanly. In reality, she died as she had lived, uncompromising, unreadable, alone, in her final hours. The room was dim. Her ladies knelt at the edges of the chamber, not daring to weep aloud. Outside the palace, the Thames moved slowly under a clouded sky, and the city waited. No bells rang, no messengers ran. It was as if the world itself held its breath. Then, just before dawn on the 14th day of March in the year 1603, the Queen stopped breathing. No last word, no cry, no benediction, only stillness, only the quiet, painted mask. And thus ended the reign of Elizabeth Regina. Not with thunder, not with pageantry, but with the collapse of silence into memory. There was no proclamation from her lips, no sealed parchment, no blazing trumpet of transition. And yet, as dawn rose over the river on that pale March morning in the year 1603, England already knew who would wear the crown. For 45 years, Elizabeth had ruled alone. And for 45 years, she had refused to name her successor. And now, in death, she left behind not a chosen heir, but a silence filled with only one name: James. James of Scotland. James, son of Mary. James, the Protestant king raised on suspicion and scripture, groomed in shadow, to one day inherit the throne of the queen who had imprisoned and executed his mother. It was irony too sharp for poetry and too heavy for politics. Yet, in the end, it was James who would walk through the gates of London, not by conquest, not by marriage, not by decree, but by inevitability. The crown, once guarded so fiercely by Elizabeth's silence, now crossed the border carried by whisper, by hope, and by the necessity of peace. Inside Richmond Palace, Elizabeth's body lay still. Her ladies wept behind heavy curtains, unsure whether to mourn or wait. Outside, the counselors gathered, Men who had served her since her youth now stood shoulder to shoulder, aging themselves, facing the question she had never answered. William Cecil, once her rock of state, was gone, but his son, Robert Cecil, stood in his place, a man who knew that uncertainty breeds rebellion, and that England could not afford a vacuum, even for a day. The plan had already been written, not by Elizabeth, but by those who loved her and feared chaos more than honesty. For years, Robert Cecil had quietly corresponded with James, offering reassurances, gauging temperament, preparing a path. These were not treasons. These were calculations, acts of loyalty to the realm more than to the Queen. And now, with Elizabeth gone and the nation hushed, Cecil opened the sealed letters, lit the beacon of transition, and watched the wheels begin to turn. No council meeting was called. No debate held. No rival put forward. In a country that had once spilled oceans of blood over the matter of succession, the transfer of power happened with the silence of snowfall. James was proclaimed King of England within hours. Messengers rode north. Bells began to toll. And for the first time in centuries, the crowns of England and Scotland would rest on the same head. But not everyone celebrated. In corners of the country, there were murmurs of doubt. Some asked why Elizabeth had never spoken. Others questioned whether Arbella Stewart or Edward Seymour had been overlooked too easily. There were Catholics who still believed the Pope would excommunicate this new king, as he had the last queen. There were courtiers who had invested too much in the Grey Line, or the Yorkist claims, or in fantasies of some yet unknown heir emerging from the wings. But no resistance rose. Elizabeth had ruled too well, too long, for rebellion to find oxygen in the wake of her death. She had left behind no child, no clear heir, but she had left behind order, a functioning state, a proud navy, a disciplined court, and though she had never crowned James with her own hands, the people understood that the Queen who had outlived all rivals had, by her silence, chosen the only man who remained standing. James received the news in Edinburgh with composure, if not surprise. He had waited his entire life for this moment. He had played the long game, bowed where others demanded, flattered when flattery seemed weak, and allowed the English court to forget he was a king in his own right. Now he would be King of England, King of Scotland, and with the passing of one woman, an entire island shifted beneath his feet. He prepared his journey south with care. There were no fanfares. Not at first. He moved slowly, deliberately. Letters went ahead of him. Courtiers met him along the road. Each stop was a performance of control, of humility, of calm. He wore the role like a second skin, practiced and precise. But beneath the layers, he must have known the truth. This was a crown he had not earned, but inherited through absence. He had been chosen not because of love, but because no one else remained. As he neared London, the city prepared itself. Banners were hung, streets swept, bells rang again, this time not for death, but for a king. Yet even in their welcome, the people looked behind them, toward the place where Elizabeth now rested. They did not forget her. They could not. She had become England in a way no monarch had before, and few would again. Her image still hung in halls and hearts alike. Her motto semper idem, always the same, echoed, even as everything began to change. And that change came quickly. With James's accession came the beginning of the Stuart era. The slow unwinding of the Tudor myth. Court life softened. Ceremonies shifted. The tight choreography of Elizabeth's presence gave way to a different kind of rule, more open, more male, less luminous. Parliament gained ground. Religious tensions reawakened. And in quiet rooms, some whispered of the Virgin Queen as if she were already a golden age long past. But for a brief moment, just one shining moment, James reigned in peace. No war erupted at his crowning. No blood was spilled to place him on the throne. And in that peaceful transfer, Elizabeth's final lesson was written that sometimes the greatest power lies not in declarations or decrees, but in the authority of a silence so complete that the world bends around it. She had not named James, but she had left the crown where he would find it. And in doing so, she had allowed history to write her last line without ever lifting her pen. They dressed her in white, the color of virginity, of marble, of myth. They laid her body inside a coffin lined with lead, heavy and cold, fit not for a woman, but for a monument. And above the wood, they placed her likeness, not her face, an effigy carved in her image, painted white, adorned in jewels, her red gold wig towering, her scepter gripped in a hand that would never rule again. The queen was dead. But in the days that followed, she looked more queenly than ever. Elizabeth had always understood the power of performance in life. She had painted herself with ceruse and flame, wrapped herself in symbolism, buried the woman beneath the icon. And now, in death, that ritual continued. Her funeral would not be a mere burial. It would be the final act in a play that had run for 45 years. The closing curtain on the Elizabethan stage. Every fold of velvet. Every tolling bell. Every black-draped horse that marched through London's streets would whisper not only of grief, but of transformation. A reign had ended. An age had ended. England would never be the same again. The day of the procession arrived on the 28th of April. In the year 1603, it was grey and still, as if the sky itself had paused. The streets were packed with mourners, commoners, and nobles. Children lifted onto shoulders. Widows, dressed in black. Some had seen her with their own eyes in youth, standing radiant upon the balcony. Others had only known her name, spoken in reverence and in fear. Now they came to say goodbye to the only monarch they had ever known. No one living could remember a time before Elizabeth. Now, suddenly, everyone would have to learn how to live without her. The carriage that bore her was no carriage at all, but a towering black chariot drawn by 4 massive horses draped in funeral velvet. Their hooves muffled, their heads bowed. It moved slowly through the city, escorted by soldiers, bishops, heralds, and peers. Behind it walked her household, her ladies, the lords of her council, each step marking the end of a world they had spent a lifetime serving. There were no cheers, no cries, only silence, broken by the tolling of bells and the murmurs of prayers half remembered. The effigy above the coffin stared out with painted serenity. But beneath that sculpture lay a body hollowed by time, poisoned by years of white lead, exhausted by rule. The woman who had once commanded armies, who had danced with foreign princes, who had faced down the Armada and executed her own cousin, now rested in stillness. She had become history. But the people watching did not weep only for a queen. They wept for the loss of certainty, for the closing of a chapter they had never wanted to end. The procession wound its way to Westminster Abbey, a place filled with the bones of kings and saints, a vault of memory carved from stone. There, beneath vaulted ceilings and golden light, Elizabeth was laid to rest beside her sister Mary. In life, they had been rivals, one Catholic, one Protestant, one flame, one ice. In death, they now lay side by side, as if history itself wished to bind them together, unwilling to let either story end without the other. The prayers were said, the rites performed, the coffin lowered, and with that, the Tudor line was buried. But what echoed louder than liturgy was the silence that followed. Elizabeth had reigned for so long, so singularly, that no one knew how to fill the space she left behind. Her courtiers had aged in her service. Her artists had painted her more goddess than woman. Her enemies had long since died or faded into memory. And now the Virgin Queen, the woman who had refused to wed, refused to bear, refused to name, had vanished, leaving no heir but England itself. In the weeks after her funeral, London wore mourning not just in color but in mood. Her image remained in every hall. Her face lingered on coins, on walls, in dreams. Some whispered that they could still hear her voice in the wind, that the bells still rang too long, that even the sun seemed to shine differently. The court shifted to James, but it did not yet belong to him. Elizabeth's shadow stretched into his throne room. Her presence remained like the scent of incense in a chapel, long after the candles have gone out. And so, while the new king prepared his coronation, while poets scribbled verses for a man not yet beloved, the people clung to the woman they had lost. Some called her Gloriana. Others called her Good Queen Bess. Some remembered her as brilliant, others as cold. But all agreed she had been unlike any other, not merely because of what she had done, but because of what she had refused. Refused to marry, refused to name, refused to disappear quietly. She had become her reign, and now the reign had ended. The woman became legend. At the gates of the abbey, there is a statue, a seated Elizabeth, holding a book, crowned and still, but no statue, no song, no tomb could fully contain what she had become. Her true legacy walked in the streets, sailed across oceans, and spoke in English voices across the world. She had not left a child, but she had left an empire. She had not passed down her crown, but she had passed down her idea. And even centuries later, when the world looks back, it does not simply say she died. It says the age died with her. She left behind no crown for a child, no cradle beside her throne, no heir to bear her likeness in the portraits of kings. She died with no one to call her mother, no bloodline to continue her reign, no royal infant to inherit the weight of England's scepter. And yet, when the earth closed above her at Westminster, Elizabeth had already given England something far more enduring than a name written in a family tree. She had given it a story, a legend carved in silence, a monarchy reborn not through lineage, but through will. In the world of kings and princes, she had played a different game. Where others fathered sons, she fathered a myth. Where others sealed their legacy in marriage contracts and christening fonts, she built hers in theater, in war, in ritual. Hers was a kingdom ruled by presence, not proximity. She had never needed to hold a child in her arms to reshape a nation. She had only needed to hold the crown and never let it go. Her enemies had once called her barren. They mocked her childlessness as weakness. But the truth was more profound. Elizabeth's England was her child, her people, her policy, her language, her vision. These were the heirs she raised. And in the decades after her death, they multiplied, they colonized, translated, expanded. The sun would one day rise, and set on a globe where her voice still echoed, where her decisions still shaped shores far beyond the gray walls of the tower or the velvet steps of the abbey. She had refused to name a successor, not from spite, but from understanding. To name was to release, to point to another was to open the door to forgetting. And Elizabeth could never allow herself to be forgotten. That was not pride. That was survival. She had grown up watching queens fall, mothers beheaded, sisters cursed, stepmothers executed, consorts buried under dynasties, not their own. She had learned that a woman's power in monarchy was rarely her own, unless she made it so. So she made it so. She stood alone and remained standing. She wrote no child's name into the succession, but she wrote her own into history. And the generations that came after, even those who wore other surnames and spoke in other tongues, could not escape her shadow. She had turned her reign into a mirror in which every future queen and many kings would measure themselves. They would remember her not as someone who had power, but as someone who was power. And even centuries later, the world still asks the same questions. How did she endure without a husband? How did she rule without a son? How did she hold together a kingdom without a guarantee of what came next? The answer is always the same. She held herself together. Her silence was her answer. Her mask was her shield. Her refusal was her language. Where others gave in, she withstood. Where others spoke too much, she spoke just enough. And while others tried to build dynasties through children, Elizabeth built hers through the theater of rule. And though James would inherit her throne, he would never inherit her crown. Not truly. It had been forged for her head alone. He ruled by her absence, not her invitation. And for all his proclamations and parades, he never captured the soul of a people in the way the Virgin Queen had. Where she had dazzled, he stumbled. Where she had stood still and watched the world move, he moved too quickly and lost their gaze. Elizabeth had ruled by pause, by breath, by the space between certainty and speculation. And in that breathless space, she became something more than royal. She became eternal. Today, her name is sewn into the fabric of a language spoken around the world. Her face is etched in silver and stone. Her words are quoted, heir dissected. Her story reimagined again and again. And still, no version feels quite complete, because she left us no blueprint, no heirloom, no confessional letter beneath a pillow. She left us only a riddle. And that, perhaps, was the point. Elizabeth was the queen who left nothing. No husband. No heir. No dynasty. And yet, she left everything.